You think you know him. Fat king, 6 wives, the beheader in a feather hat, the portraits in schoolbooks fix him mid-strut. Chin high, codpiece like a threat, a man too big for a century to contain. But that version is a costume we inherited from flattery and fear. Strip it off, and what's left is harder to look at. I'm not here to polish a crown. I'm here to turn the torch on the rot no one wants to smell. The real Henry VIII wasn't just a tyrant. He was a slow-motion catastrophe trapped in royal flesh, and everyone near him learned to pretend that catastrophe looked like God's will. Picture a palace that pretends it normal. Lutes in the gallery, silver on the board, Latin murmur by scholars about divine right and order. Now add the truth that cut through all of it. The king's body was failing in public. Servants drew lots to stand near him. Tailors learned to stitch sleeves wide enough to hide swelling. Doors were widened for chairs with hidden pulleys. The scent reached the corridor first, then the man. People said they were loyal. Mostly they were trying not to gag. Power and decay make a particular kind of horror together. When a butcher is unwell, he closes his stall. When a king putrefies, the state keeps playing music and calls it majesty. That's how you get a court where cruelty is policy, because it is cheaper than admitting weakness. You can trace the line from his bandaged leg to a widow's black veil, from a physician's silence to a scaffold slick at dawn. It wasn't just that he ruled badly. It was that he used the parts of him that hurt as an argument for why everyone else should. Maybe you heard a schoolyard factoid, that his coffin burst in the gases of his own body. The tale is ghastly, and in the telling, you can smell how much people needed a story big enough to match the fear he shoved into them while living. Whether or not the wood actually split is almost beside the point. What mattered was the feeling that even in death, he made a mess other people had to clean. So let's flip the frame. Forget the banqueting poses and the jingling of gold. Follow the stains instead. This will not be a polite promenade through a king's curriculum vitae. It will be an autopsy of a body and of a country that learned to call sickness strength because it depended on a sick man's favor. If you want heroics, turn away now. If you want the truth, hold your breath and step closer. We're opening the door to the privy chamber, where history pretends not to look. This is not a ghost story. It's worse. It's a record of how absolute power strapped itself to a failing body and demanded applause while it rotted, and how we, centuries later, still confuse the applause with evidence that the show deserved to go on. By the time we're done, the swaggering myth will look paper-thin against the flesh and blood record. You'll see the pulleys and poultices, the stage dinners and stage confessions, the way fear turns men into furniture. Hold on to the myth if you like. I'm going to show you the monster we built to serve it. By his last decade, the measurements said more than the courtiers dared. A tailor once whispered 54, meaning inches, and crossed himself like he'd named a demon. The royal harness, what they politely called a chair, had a hidden winch worked by footmen. I watched them brace their boots and heave while the cord squealed, raising the king an inch, then another, until his bulk tipped into motion. Dignity became a choreography. We performed it because fear required it. The leg was a tyrant inside the tyrant. 2 ulcers tunneled deep, angry as furnaces. They wept through linen and herbs until everything he owned smelled faintly of rot and rose water. The surgeons packed him with wool and honey, then wine, vinegar, turpentine, whatever could sting enough to feel like control. Some days the seepage forced 3 changes of stockings before noon. I learned to breathe through my mouth, and then to hold even that breath when the dressings came off. Dressing him was a rota and a threat. Mind yourself, the Lord Chamberlain would say, which meant, stand close and your stomach can bear or be punished. Boys who misfiled papers were promoted to sleeve bearers. Men who spoke out of turn discovered a sudden calling to fetch basin water for the royal foot. The grooms of the stool, once a jest, became envied and feared at once. Envy because they had his ear, fear because they had everything else. Humiliation burns men in 2 directions. In him it went outward. He learned to weaponize his own helplessness. If his body betrayed him, then everyone must betray theirs. Stand, bow, inhale, smile, until the room looked like obedience again. If a face creased, that face disappeared. If a surgeon winced, he was replaced by another who said the stench meant healing. You'd be amazed what people can call progress when a crown is watching. He tried to walk sometimes. Braces hugged his knees, and a stick knocked the tiles. 3 steps, then breath like a bellows, then the chair. The weight collected everywhere. Neck swollen above a jeweled collar. Fingers like sausages around a cup, belly resting heavy as a sleeping animal on his lap. Strong, people said when he raised a cup. Majestic, when he settled. The words grew lighter as the man grew heavier. The palace adjusted to him the way a river shapes to a dam. Door frames widened. Ramps appeared where stairs had been. The clock of the day reset around dressings, poultices, dozes. Musicians were brought nearer, so he didn't have to move to hear them. Petitioners learned to deliver letters from an arm's length, then closer still as the king's eyes narrowed. He needed you near enough to prove you couldn't flinch. Cruelty is easy when movement is hard. He could not cross the room to confront you, but he could crook one finger and have the room bring you to him. That became his favorite exercise. Proximity as punishment. Come forward. Kneel. Stay. The stink would do the lecturing, the crown the sentencing. By dusk, I went to my chamber tasting iron and perfume, telling myself the day's nausea meant I had served my country. In truth, all I had served was a body that demanded witnesses. They say monsters are born evil. I learned they can be made, with a fall, a blow, an hour when the lights of a man's skull go out and never all return. I wasn't yet in service when it happened, but every old hand kept the story folded like a blood-stained letter. Greenwich, winter of 1536. The king glittered at the tilt, stubborn about proving he was still iron under silk. A horse reared, a lance slid where no lance should, and the mountain of man in armor crashed to earth. They whispered he lay, without speech, for hours. He woke, but not all of him woke with him. Before that, he could be generous like weather in April, sudden sun between clouds. After, the clouds learned to throw lightning. He forgot names, then remembered insults. He laughed too much at small jests and stared too long at imagined slights. The appetite that once spent itself on the hunt, and the list settled into hungers that never said enough. His face rounded, his neck thickened, and a feverish flush bloomed even when the hearth ran low. He raged without warning, then wept from pain he would not confess. We learned to measure the day by the pitch of his breathing. Physicians tried brave words at first. Melancholy. Choler. Then silence. They learned the new rule. Any diagnosis that made him feel mortal could cost a man more than his post. So they bled him with ceremony and said his color improved. They set leeches and claimed the dreams were quiet. They weighed urine against water and declared Providence satisfied. In truth, we watched the body write orders on the brain. He slept badly and dreamed loudly. He trusted no quiet. He had men hollow spaces behind the wainscot and filled them with knives, letters, and lists of names to watch. When the leg ulcers burst like wicked flowers, the pain made a furnace of him. Heat rolled off his temper and singed everyone near. Counsel learned to fly in circles like starlings dodging a hawk, tightening, turning, lying to itself to survive. We told ourselves policy had reasons. Monasteries dissolved because England needed silver. Friends arrested because proofs had been found. Wives set aside because God demanded a son. In the quiet, we admitted the proofs were often moods, the reasons often pain. He would read a letter and find mockery where none lived. He would order a head off to silence a thought that hadn't yet found words. It is a terrible thing to see a seal pressed into wax to ease a night terror. Paranoia moved into the palace like a permanent guest. He tested doors twice, then 5 times. He ordered a new lock for his closet, then forgot which key fitted, then accused a locksmith of treachery for crafting a lock that dared confuse a king. He demanded music and banished it in the same hour. Once at supper, he raged that the candles were jeering with their flicker. The next night he dined in near dark, satisfied the flames had learned obedience. We taught our faces to be still as plaster. A flinch could end a career. A wince could end a life. The worst part wasn't the shouting. It was the certainty that beneath the thunder there was fear, the kind that makes a man strike first at whoever looks like they might think. We saw it most with the women who shared his table and his bed. A tenderness would cross his face like a swift shadow. Then he'd remember he could fall, and tenderness would burn to ash. Love became a trespass punished as treason. Courtiers called it majesty. I called it a wound that had learned to speak. You can stitch a leg and bind a belly, but you cannot poultice a thought once it festers. After the fall, the king's mind learned the same trick his body had. When threatened, swell. He swelled to fill every room, every decision, every fear. By then we were not ruled by laws or councils or even the man we had known. We were ruled by the injury that refused to heal and by our terror of naming it. Marriage, for him, was a lever, not a vow. I learned that in the corridors, where silk whispered warnings long before proclamations did. A queen might arrive to trumpets and leave to the sound of quills, ink scratching her name into a word that meant exile. The bedchamber was an annex of the council chamber, and we were all drafted into its paperwork. Catherine of Aragon taught me the first lesson. Refusal cost a woman everything and a king nothing. She would not call her child illegitimate, would not call herself divorced, and so the court called her obstinate and sent her north to corridors colder than any cathedral. I carried a basket of oranges to her once, at the request of a lady who used to share her prayers. "Tell them I am wife," she said, fingers chapped and steady. I told no one. Some truths were already treason. And Bullen taught me how quickly a smile can curdle into a charge. We were summoned to watch the making of proof. Musicians questioned until melodies sounded like confession. Gentlemen named in lists long enough to rap the scaffold. The king looked ill that week, shockingly tender with his hounds and brutally efficient with his justice. A tailor whispered that he was having a new suit cut before the swordsman had even sailed. I did not know if that was true. I only know the air tasted metallic from the Tower to Whitehall, and everyone learned to speak of her in the past tense before the past had arrived. Jane Seymour taught us the speed of replacement. He wept at her lying in and smiled for sun. Then the bells tolled and the doors shut upon a queen who had done everything right except survive. Mourning should have been a season. Instead, it was a weekend. The tapestries remained. The cradle rocked. The envoys were fed and told to bring sketches of princesses, as if they were bolts of silk. We measured mercy in hours, policy in rings. Anne of Cleves taught us the vocabulary of undoing. Physicians and matrons were summoned to examine what should have been left to night and privacy. Paper spoke of not consummated, as if language could make a marriage vanish without leaving a bruise. She was sensible in a way that saved her head. She smiled, accepted a new house, called him brother, and stopped being dangerous. We feared a woman who loved him. We pitied one who learned faster. Catherine Howard taught us how terror can be legislated. Girls were questioned about years when they were still girls. Laughter in a dormitory became a dossier. A law was read that made yesterday's secret into today's noose. The king's face during those councils was the face of a man punishing a mirror. He touched his leg often, as if the pain there were proof that someone else must pay. Catherine Parr taught us the one strategy that worked. Make yourself his conscience, and then flatter the conscience until it purrs. She argued scripture with him. Then in the next breath called herself his humble student. When the net closed, accusations already inked, she knelt and said she only wished to soothe his pains and ease his mind with holy talk. He let her rise. She rose further by standing still. We told ourselves this was all the reasonable administration of a complicated household. In truth, we watched private humiliations put in the livery of law, trials written backward from verdicts, annulments carved with compliments, acts of parliament born from one man's bed and one nation's fear of contradicting it. The queens became instruments, bells rung to summon policy, drums to march us toward whatever the day's insecurity demanded. I used to think marriage domesticated power. Here I learned it can militarize the home. Each wedding shifted the furniture of the realm. Each farewell rearranged our souls. We ate, prayed, swore, and lied around a table where love was the most dangerous spice. If you ask me what a tyrant looks like, I will not point first to scaffold. I will point to a bed that drafts laws in the dark and a country that wakes to obey them. Power eats. I learned that in the sculleries before dawn, when the palace breathed smoke and the flagstones sweated with fat, we like to claim the kitchens nourished England by nourishing its king. In truth, they were a forge where appetite was hammered into policy. Fires flared at cockcrow. Boys ran sugar to confectioners. Men with arms like oars turned spits the length of a canoe. Ledgers swelled. Every hare, swan, and barrel of oysters had a number beside its name and a name beside its number. Another hand noted who tasted, who watched the taster, who sealed the salt, who counted the knives. We tallied like prisoners scratching days on stone, lest to measure abundance than approved fear hadn't interrupted the feast. The body that could not cross a room still conquered the table. Courses marched like troops. Soups, pies, lacquered joints, birds rebuilt in sugar. He performed hunger the way he performed piety, ritualized, public, meant to be witnessed. There was grace, then the sermon, meat after meat while musicians played. When a spasm bit his leg, he chewed harder, as if the mouth could beat pain into obedience. We dress superstition as science. Venison builds strong blood. Swan soothes fevers. Oysters quicken the spirit. Fruit soured his stomach? Blame the orchard. Sweets kept him wakeful? Blame foreign sugar. Water was suspect, too common. So ale was brewed gentle as rain and called safer. He disdained peasant food in public, as if simplicity could stain him. The queen might nibble greens in Lent. He would take fish as bounty and sauces as proof God approved his rank. Precautions bred like rabbits. Every dish paused at a side table where 3 mouths greeted it in turn. Taster, watcher, watcher, watcher. Each performing a little theater of survival. Sometimes he ordered a delay, a quarter hour by the sandglass, as if fear could be digested first. Then impatience won, and the fork rose anyway. Poison would have needed to be as patient as his whims. Treachery prefers swifter work than a kitchen can manage. These feasts were not about eating. They declared that nothing, not even pain, could dictate to him. He tore a capon like a writ of defiance. He licked grease from the finger that could sign a death warrant and called the sauce clean. Courtiers laughed on cue. Ambassadors stole glances at the twitching leg and wrote home about English splendor. I lifted lids, counted cups, and heard the argument in the clatter. The king is well, the king is strong, the king does not suffer. After the music came medicine. We'd hoist the belly to bind what the day had unbound. He groaned, took a cordial, swore off excess, then ordered a private tray to settle the physic. Morning brought the same vows and the same drums in the kitchens. Denial needs feeding too. I used to think gluttony was a vice of softness. Here it was a dialect of rule. He ate like a man bargaining with his own flesh. Obey me and I will feed you. The body never kept the bargain. So portions swelled, sugar grew more intricate, precautions more absurd, and the court more practiced at pretending the heaviness in our stomachs meant the country was thriving. We applauded until our palms stung. The truth sat steaming on the platter, and we passed it down the line with the bones. Fear is a carpenter. It remakes the house to fit itself. By the time I held a key to the privy galleries, the palace had quietly grown teeth. A door opened behind a tapestry, then another behind that. Short corridors where a man could vanish and listen while courtiers rehearsed loyalty. The king tested them by arriving from the wrong direction, standing in a pocket of dark to count who laughed before he did. His bedchamber became a fortress. 2 pistols slept under the pillow. A mace lay within the coverlet. A bell cord hung by his hand for nights when pain rose like a thief. He pulled it often. The yeoman learned to run, without clanking. Passwords changed nightly. A stumble over a syllable could end career. Salt lived under seal. Water was decanted with witnesses. The ewers were locked. Then the keys to those locks were signed for twice a day and counted at vespers. I saw a queen's maid dismissed for lending her master a pinch of salt without a countersign. Innocence, the chamberlain said, is a luxury we can't afford. We boiled everything, meat, wine, rumors, until only the dullest flavor remained. You could not speak without speaking to a wall. The wall had ears. The ears served a clerk. The clerk served a secretary. I wrote reports on the men who wrote reports about me. Spies on spies was a joke we did not tell. Even the prince's tutor sent sealed notes about which psalms steadied him and which made him defiant. His steps were few. His reach grew long. He liked lists and maps because they moved when he could not. He stretched red silk threads between names like nets. If a thread touched you, you were hauled from the crowd and laid at his feet. Sometimes there was a letter. Often there was only the mood of a bad night. We told ourselves preemption was wisdom. In truth, we dug graves for futures that hadn't happened yet. He rehearsed danger until it saluted. Doors were opened twice, then closed twice, then tried again to ensure no friendly hand had turned traitor between first and second touch. Windows were latched in rain and sun. He said drafts carry plots. Once he dragged a bed because a knot in the floorboard looked like an eye. A joiner planed a plank. The knot returned in dreams. 3 servants were questioned about who had set the eye to glare. Night councils fogged the candles. Names were offered like gifts. Confessions wrote themselves. A man might volunteer to accuse first in order to live second. It worked for a season. Another season came. Terror is a crop that promises harvest without end. There is a silence before an arrest. The air turns brittle. You feel it before you hear the boots. At supper the king ate on. Pleased the soup stayed hot. We learn a flatter lesson than any sermon. When a ruler's nerves become law, everyone lives downstream of a private tremor. By then the palace felt less like a home than a diagram. Arrows pointing inward toward bed, where a man pretended sleep. We tiptoed around his nightmares and called it governance. If you ask what policy looked like, I will show you a keyring, a blank warrant, and a candle guttering in a corridor no window dared face. The last weeks were counted in lifts and stains. For men to turn him, 6 to raise him, 8 to carry the chair over thresholds shaved smooth. Ulcers tunneled their own roads. Poultices hissed on contact. Linens learned his nights, sour, then sweet with spices, then sour again. Windows stayed latched because he feared drafts and rumors. The air went old. His body swelled like a river when thaw comes wrong. Ankles vanished. Fingers dimpled. Breath became a wage paid in groans. The physician wrote dropsy, then scratched it out because the word looked like surrender. We discarded any word that hinted at defeat. Restorative for opiates, comforting drafts for sleep. He demanded sermons, then cursed the preacher. He demanded music, snapped strings with temper. He demanded we swear we could smell nothing. Moving him was a liturgy. Sheets rolled, winch sighed. Someone counted, 1, 2, lift, and the grooms of the stool took their posts. He tried to stand and barked when a leg fired. After that, the chair decided when he rose. He watched painted angels as if they mocked him. We dressed infection as ceremony. New linens, new herbs, bright ewers so no one looked at stains. A new boy bit his lip until it bled rather than flinch. I learned to hold my breath for the length of prayer. When I breathed again, the room tasted of iron and cloves. Death circles before it lands. We heard it in boots that slowed and in the hush that settled. Even enemies spoke softly, as if sound might snap the last thread. One night, he gripped my wrist, a hot, damp weight, and asked if I believed in miracles. I told him yes. He shut his eyes and said, "Then believe I will not stink." It was the only time he named the truth. When it came like an exhale that forgot to return. The chamber did not cry. It sagged. We washed him in wine, dressed him in velvet, bound the sores where cloth could not pretend. Carpenters fixed extra boards to the coffin. The locksmith hammered longer screws. We set jars of herbs, as if scent could argue with what the body had decided. Guards doubled, though there was nothing left to guard but rumor. The procession felt like moving a storm that had lost its thunder. Still the air warped with stories. A creak inside the box, a drop at the seam. I do not know. I only know that even stopped. He made work for us. New linens, new washings, new oaths that all was as it should be. Majesty had been costume. Logistics were the truth. In the end, we were not glorifying a king, only wrestling a failing carcass into ritual shapes, so the country could pretend a man had ever fit them. The angels kept smiling. I held my breath until I could leave and breathe for myself. After he was gone, the palace kept walking in his gate. We still checked locks twice, then once more for the habit of dread. The bells rang for a new reign, yet the sound traveled through old corridors that remember how to listen. People spoke softer in rooms where he had slept, as if breath itself might be accused. The yeoman moved slower, not from age, but from years of learning to make no sound the king hadn't ordered. Trauma lingers like a smell in wool. Wash it, perfume it, hold it to sunlight. Some part stays. Stories did what bodies cannot. They moved freely. A maid fainted by the chapel and swore she'd heard knocking from a box that wasn't there. An old groom died and the hall blamed palace air. Someone said the candles guttered at the hour he once dined. I don't swear to any of it. I swear to the need that invented it. The need to make the fear we lived through large enough to explain the way it still lived in us. He went into ground. A legend rose because gravity alone could not account for what we had carried. The state inherited the furniture of suspicion. Warrants still lay ready. Rooms still had more doors than they needed. Men who had survived by accusing could not wake as saints just because a procession had passed. A law made in the heat of one man's power can cool into custom, and custom is as quiet as jail. The next council spoke of prudence. I counted how often prudence meant keeping a key that no longer fit any honest lock. I used to think kingship made monsters. Now I know it is more ordinary and more terrible than that. Deny a man's frailty, and he will spend whatever power he has left proving you right. Strap a nation to that denial, and it will mistake cruelty for strength, because cruelty keeps the lie intact. We were not merely ruled by a sick man. We were ruled by the theater that told us sickness could not touch a crown. Where does that leave us who served? Some left, some prayed, some wrote. I stayed and learned to speak plainly about what everyone preferred as rumor. I tell you this so that when you look at the famous portraits, the sleeves, the jewels, the stance that tries to anchor the world, you remember what the painter left out. Winches, bandages, the faces holding their breath. Remember that a state can rot politely if no one names the smell. If there's a moral, it is small enough to carry in a pocket. Power needs air. Close it up with flattery and fear, and it will sour. Call a wounded body immortal, and it will punish you for telling the truth later. We prayed for miracles. We got logistics. We asked for majesty. We got a man. I have other rooms to open if you can bear them. The hidden histories that explain why our myths shine so hard they blind. Stay, and I'll light the next candle.